Around 4,000 years ago, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt, physicians and priests were trying to do something that had absolutely nothing to do with medicine as we'd recognize it today. They were trying to identify which god a person had offended. When someone sank into despair, stopped eating, stopped speaking, or trembled with unexplainable dread, the explanation offered by nearly everyone around them was the same. A demon had taken residence, a curse had found its mark, an angry spirit was punishing the household. Priests called a Shipu were summoned, not doctors. They performed exorcisms, recited incantations, and prescribed amulets meant to drive the offending spirit back out through ritual rather than treatment. This wasn't stupidity. It was simply a completely different theory of where suffering came from. If the mind broke, the reasoning went, something from outside had broken it. Nobody in Babylon or early Thebes believed the mind itself could just malfunction on its own. So how did we get from priests reading omens over a trembling patient to hospitals running dedicated psychiatric wards, 1,000 years before Western medicine caught up to the idea? The answer runs through a Greek physician who renamed suffering after a bodily fluid, a group of Roman philosophers who accidentally invented cognitive therapy, a golden age of medicine in Baghdad that Europe would take centuries to rediscover, and a European relapse straight back into demons. Let's start with the moment the story actually turns. By the 5th century BCE, a Greek physician named Hippocrates had grown tired of gods getting credit for illness. He proposed something radical for his era, that all disease, including disorders of mood, came from imbalances inside the body itself, specifically in excess of one of 4 bodily fluids he called humors. Too much of the fluid known as black bile, he argued, produced a state he named melancholia, built directly from the Greek words for black and bile. That word would go on to dominate medical thinking about depression for the next 2,000 years, long after anyone still believed the fluid itself was real. This was progress, genuine progress, because suffering had finally moved out of the temple and into the body. But the treatments that followed were often nearly as brutal as the disease. Bloodletting, forced purging, starvation diets designed to drain the offending fluid out of a suffering patient. Hippocrates had successfully given depression a medical name. He just didn't yet have anything humane to offer once he'd named it. Around the same centuries, a separate group of thinkers in Rome was building something quieter, without ever calling it medicine at all. Stoic philosophers like Epictetus and later the Emperor Marcus Aurelius argued that a great deal of anxiety came not from events themselves, but from the stories a person told themselves about those events. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire and privately terrified like anyone else, wrote to himself that if he was distressed by anything external, the pain wasn't from the thing itself, but from his own judgment about it, and that judgment could be revoked at any moment. Epictetus put it even more bluntly. People are disturbed not by things, but by their opinions about things. Their method involved rehearsing worst-case outcomes in advance to strip them of their power, separating what a person could control from what they couldn't, and treating destructive emotion as a pattern of thought that could actually be examined and rebuilt rather than simply endured. There were no therapists, no sessions, no clinical framework at all. And yet the core mechanism sitting quietly inside these writings, identify the distorted thought, challenge it, replace it, is recognizably the same engine that would eventually become cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective treatments in modern psychiatry. It just sat undiscovered in old scrolls for close to 2,000 years before anyone thought to build a clinical system on top of it. So by this point, 2 entirely different civilizations had independently landed on 2 entirely different pieces of the same puzzle, a biological explanation and a cognitive one. Neither had actually built anything a modern patient could walk into. That would take a third civilization, one that doesn't get nearly enough credit in this story. In 9th and 10th century Baghdad, during the height of the Islamic Golden Age, physicians built on Hippocratic theory and pushed it somewhere genuinely institutional. The Persian physician al-Razi described melancholia in careful clinical detail and insisted explicitly that it required medical treatment, not punishment or spiritual correction. Decades later, another physician, al-Baqi, went further still. He divided mental illness into distinct categories, some of which map closely onto what we'd now call depression and anxiety. And he prescribed something genuinely new: cognitive remedies alongside physical ones, treating the mind and the body as a single connected system rather than two separate problems. Centuries before Europe would even attempt that reconnection. This wasn't just theory sitting in manuscripts, either. Physicians of this era built by Maristans, hospitals with wards specifically dedicated to psychological illness, where patients received music, storytelling, aromatherapy, and structured daily routine as genuine components of treatment. Sit with that for a second. While large parts of medieval Europe were still deciding whether the mentally ill needed an exorcism or a beating to drive out evil spirits, physicians in Baghdad were running dedicated psychiatric wards with music therapy, a practice the West wouldn't systematically reintroduce until the 20th century. Which brings us to the darkest turn in this entire story, because progress, it turns out, isn't a straight line. As Christian theology tightened its grip across medieval Europe, melancholic despair got reframed away from medicine entirely and back into sin, closely tied to aesthesia, a kind of spiritual sloth understood as dangerous distance from God. People experiencing what we'd now call severe depression or anxiety disorders were sometimes prayed over, which occasionally offered real comfort through community. But just as often they were isolated, punished, or outright accused of demonic possession, a full regression back to the exact Mesopotamian framework Hippocrates had tried to dismantle over 1,000 years earlier. Centuries of accumulated Greek and Islamic medical insight simply sat and used on the other side of the Mediterranean, while Europe relearned, the hard way, a lesson its own inherited texts had already taught it. Looking back across this entire arc, from Mesopotamian priests reading demonic possession into a trembling patient, to Hippocrates renaming that same suffering after a bodily fluid, to Roman emperors quietly inventing an early ancestor of cognitive therapy, to physicians in Baghdad building the first dedicated psychiatric wards on Earth, and then straight back into a Europe that decided suffering was sin again. The story of how humans learned to treat depression and anxiety was never straight climb toward enlightenment. It's a story about accident, regression, and rediscovery happening again and again, in cultures that rarely spoke to each other, each one stumbling onto a fragment of the same truth, that the mind can break on its own, that thought itself can be examined and reshaped, and that care, real structured care, matters as much as any single remedy. We like to imagine medical progress as one door opening after another. The real story looks more like Babylon's demons, quietly waiting in the dark, ready to come back the moment we stop paying attention to what we'd already learned.